Thank you. Is this working? Everybody hear me? Okay, good. We all have stories to tell, and I'm going to start with this story. Anyone tell me who that is? Edward Curtis. Very good, yes. He took that self-portrait in his studio just a few blocks from here in downtown Seattle. How about this guy? A little bit harder. That's J.P. Morgan, exactly, one of the so-called robber barons of Wall Street, and at the start of the 20th century, one of the richest men in the world. Well, Curtis, while he had a portrait studio here in Seattle, it wasn't just any portrait studio. He was one of the most famous portrait photographers in the world. He was equivalent to sort of Annie Leibovitz of his day. And through his connections, he wanted to promote a very big project he had in mind. So he went to J.P. Morgan, asked him for a pile of cash to make this project come into reality. Most of you probably heard of it, the North American Indian. It's one of the icons of photography and of anthropology to this day. So here's the story of how it came about, and I'll move through this quickly. Some of you probably know it, but it's fascinating, I think. So Curtis had this idea. He wanted to go document Indian life. He said to J.P. Morgan, I'll go take 1,500 photographs, and he was using a 14 by 17 view camera with glass plate negatives. So massive equipment to carry around, very fragile, very heavy. And he thought he would go out throughout the West, mostly by horseback, and take all of these pictures and document Indian life. And oh, by the way, I'll produce this gorgeous 20-volume set, which you can sell, or I will then have to sell to your rich friends to help recover some of the cost. So after some negotiations, Curtis finally went to Morgan and said, yes, I think I can do this. Morgan said, okay. And he agreed in 1906 to give $75,000 over 5 years' time for Edward Curtis to complete this project. Well, if you think about it, this is 1906, and that was $75,000 then. Anybody want to guess what $75,000 then would be now? Close. It's in that category. It's about $1.75 million is what actually Morgan agreed to give Curtis to complete this project. And here's what happened. After 5 years, he only had 8 volumes completed. But Curtis was a perfectionist. He kept wanting to go back and sometimes take the same pictures over and over again. Travel was a lot harder than he thought, and so he went back to J.P. Morgan and said, hey, I've made great progress so far, and you've had this great vision. We can't let it stop, so if you just give me some more money, he'd already blew through the $1.75 million. He said, if you give me more money, I'll get this project done. And this is what happened then. After 10 years, he'd made some more progress. In the meantime, J.P. Morgan had passed away, and his son was then in charge of the family business. So Curtis went back to J.P. Morgan's son and said, you know, I've made great progress so far. Your father had this great vision. We can't let that die. So if you give me more money, we'll get this done. Well, another 5 years passed. And of course, there was a factor in there called World War I that caused things to slow down. Everything became more expensive. The project was harder to accomplish because there were fewer people who were willing to go out and risk their lives here when the world war was going on. But finally, here's what happened. Curtis had traveled 10,000 miles all over the West, mostly by horseback. He visited 80 tribes. It took him 20 years, and he had this enormous output of work. 40,000 glass plate negatives, more than 10,000 wax cylinder recordings of songs and ceremonies and interviews, and hundreds of detailed biographical sketches. It is both the single greatest photographic document of Indian life at that time and the single greatest anthropological study. It was just an enormous project. And remember, he kept going back to the Morgan family over and over again. So he asked for and received 1.75 million equivalent, but at the end of 20 years, he actually wound up getting from the Morgan family the equivalent of $10 million to complete this project. So I want you to hold that thought, okay? $10 million. Let's fast forward to the 21st century. I'm going to go into some of the data and research that talks about who gives and why they give in today's world. So first of all, there's various categories of donors. Anybody know what the largest category is out there? So generically, individuals. It's just, this is still where most money comes from. People always say, I want to go to foundations or I want to go to corporations, but individuals are still where the vast amount of money goes. And once upon a time, way back in 2009, before there was crowdfunding, this would have been a much harder audience to reach. Now, it's a very different story. So let's look at what the research says about why individuals give. Very first reason people say when they're confronted with perhaps giving a donation is, why do I care? Is this something that's important to me? And this is when it becomes important for the photos, the visuals of a project to tell the story. Because in most cases, this is the very first way that people make a connection with an issue or a campaign. It's that visual impact that tells you this is something that you may want to care about. Second thing people care about is, will their money make a difference? Of course, I'm not going to go hand $50 or $10 or $5 if I think it's just going to go out the window. I want to know that my money might impact rainforest deforestation, or it might impact homeless people. And you begin to get ability to do that through crowdfunding, where there's a one-on-one access between donors and photographers. And most importantly, what people care about is, how can I become involved? This is the most significant change in the last decade with the advent of crowdfunding and with younger audiences becoming donors. People don't want just to become involved because they're giving dollars. They want to know, how can they personally contribute part of their lives to what is going on in the world? So that's an important part of why collaboration is a growing aspect of telling stories out there. Now, you've seen part of the slides I've shown here are Kickstarter campaigns. I personally am a big fan of Kickstarter campaigns, and I can't always have said that. I spent some time over the last year looking at photo book campaigns on Kickstarter. I learned some really interesting information. First of all, Kickstarter started in 2009. And since that time, they've launched about 8,600 photography projects. Not all of them are books. Sometimes it's new equipment. Sometimes it's a trip somebody wants to take. But if you look at those 8,600 projects, about a third of them have been funded successfully. So right off the start, that's pretty good odds. I mean, if I had a 1 in 3 chance of buying lottery tickets, I'd be out all day long, wanting to win the lottery. But here's where the details get really interesting. Look at the difference, what took place between the successful campaigns and the unsuccessful ones. The successful ones were asking for about an average of $8,500 each. The unsuccessful ones were about $575, $600 each. So if you look at those unsuccessful campaigns, these were pretty amateurish projects. These were people wanting to take their favorite vacation. They wanted to put together their grandma's photo album. They weren't really serious projects, whereas the ones that were successful were very serious projects. And I think if you look at this, you're not always really competing with those unsuccessful ones. So if you look at the balance overall, your odds are probably even better at this point in time with Kickstarter, more like 1 in 2 to run a successful project. Now, I'm not saying Kickstarter is easy. It's a hard deal. You have to be prepared to devote your time to it. But consider this. The average campaign was $8,500. Anybody know what the top photo book campaign on Kickstarter raised? Some pretty significant money. These are just the top 10 photo books that have ever been put forth on Kickstarter. People are raising sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars for their campaign. And most of these, the amount that they raised is 3 or 4 times what their goal was. They've really reached out, and because of the effort they've made and the campaign they put together, they raised significant amounts of dollars. I also spent some time looking at the top 100 photo books. This is what the statistics show on that. Top 100 photo books still average $57,000, and it took them 30 days. That's all. 30 days for most of these campaigns to work. So if I told you, 30 days from now, you could have $57,000 for your project, you might want to think seriously about that. That being said, you can't just start the campaign and walk out the door. You essentially have to devote 30 days to raising that money. You have to have that one-on-one contact with your donors, and you have to make an effort to engage them so they know their money will make a difference. So that's all I'm going to say on Kickstarter for now. There are other crowdfunding campaigns out there. By and large, Kickstarter is much more successful than any of the other ones at this time. Second category of where money comes from, I know a little bit about because I've been engaged with foundations for 25 years, is from both private and public foundations. Here's the difference when you're looking at going to money for foundations. First thing we want to know is, does it fit with our mission? Every foundation has a mission. It's got a goal, it's got something on their website, and you can't try to mismatch them. You can't go to the foundation that funds homeless causes with your environmental project. You can't go to the one that funds environmental justice with your one about health. So you've got to be able to look right up front, decide this is where you want to do. And again, the visuals will help you tell your story. You're trying to go to that foundation and say, this fits with your mission because what I've been doing tells your story. Remember that you need foundations to do some of your funding for your work, but the foundations need you to tell their story. If somebody comes to me, I want to know, who's your partner? Where's the collaboration? Because photos in and of themselves don't tell the full story. They're just one aspect. Some vendors may even look at them just a tool. They're just a tool that you use. But it's important to look at, if you're going to come to me or a foundation with a project, who are you working with? Is it somebody I've heard of? Is it somebody we're already funding? Is it somebody that seems like a trusted agent, no matter who it is? And again, you look at some of these examples and you get a sense of the ones that are successful are already collaborating by the time they've gotten to the funding source. This is a critical question that has become more and more important because funders are especially not only looking for how will this make a difference, but will it provide a pathway? Nobody's expecting a miracle from any single campaign. Nobody's expecting you to provide your photographs to suddenly change the whole dynamic of a story. But does it provide a way toward a solution? Is there something in what you're telling through your visual images that will lead the funding that we're going to give you toward a betterment of the situation that we're already facing? Finally, of course, every foundation wants to know how will the money make a difference? And this is where it gets tricky. I mean, this is a great example. This woman not only went out and took photographs of thousands of toxic sites across the country, but she created a website that was interactive that allowed people to look for those sites. This is another project where looking at war in Tripoli. And again, there's an interactive component there of trying to figure out where these refugees are going. I think more and more it's important to, when you're trying to sell something to a foundation, you want to say that your partnership with other organizations, nonprofits, makes the pathway toward the change that you want to achieve. Smaller part of funding is out there is corporations. It's still a very important part for some areas because you want support from camera equipment, you want software, services, drone manufacturers, you name it. There's a very large number of corporations that do support the kind of work you're doing. And again, first thing they're going to want to know is, does this support an area where we have an office? Is it something that's maybe local to our foundation? They also may want to know, is it supported by our employees? In some cases, this is important, you can go to an employee at a corporation and have them pitch the idea for you. Also, a lot of corporations have matching funds in which their employees can contribute to a project that the corporation is funding as well. So when you're beginning to look at how can I get my idea into some of these larger corporations? Think about, do you know somebody who works there? Do you know somebody who has a friend who works there? How can you get in, not personally sometimes, but just through the back door? Some corporations have ability to allow a number of different foundation or nonprofits come in and make pitches to their employees and to their general staff. And of course, no surprise, every corporation wants to know, how will this enhance our brand? So it's always great if you can show their equipment in your photos or somehow show your equipment as part of their stories. If you're working with an image company like Getty, some of the other companies out there, you want to know that these photographs are promoting your services. And remember that not every contribution is $10,000 or $100,000. Sometimes you just want a new tripod, or you want some new software. This is an individual photographer's website, and this is what he shows on his website. These are all, as he calls them, partners in his works. All people who have contributed, and each one of these might have only been a few $100, maybe a few $1,000, but that's all money that you didn't have to spend because he's got corporate partners giving to him. And finally, there's this other category called all others. This is things like universities, arts councils, tourism bureaus are becoming more and more involved in funding for some projects. And you get a lot of sort of eclectic interest here, which is really, I think if you're looking at a project that maybe you think this doesn't fit with anything else that I've been talking about, some of these smaller entities are really interesting in what they're funding and how they're doing outreach. More and more online magazines that are developing just around photography are doing small grant programs. That is a good place to start if you're maybe just starting in your career, or if you're looking for something that doesn't quite fit with the larger issue-oriented work that's out there. So that's part of the who. Let's get to the why. Why do people give? This is what the research shows you. First of all, if you've got a reputation, if you're somebody who is already reasonably well known out there, there are some funding sources that will give to you just to further your reputation. These are kind of like the 1%ers of the photography world, but there are people out there, might even be some in this room, but this is an important category because it shows that as you develop your portfolio, as you work with others and develop your reputation, you can reach a certain stature where people recognize your work is important and want to support you to see more of your work regardless of what it is. In most cases, however, it's going to come down to some other categories that are there. People want to see, first of all, a connection with other people. If I'm thinking about giving, a lot of the money that's being funded out there goes to causes that are related to homelessness, to migrants, immigrants, to children. All of these, I mean, there's no rocket science to any of this. These are just good examples I think you should know of that people are funding through various sources right now. And again, every single one of these images is so compelling. I mean, it just hooks you in some way to know what's going on. Why is this happening? Another category why people want to support things are places. We all have places we care about. Some places have suffered through environmental degradation. Some places are where we live or have once lived that are really important to us in our memories or in our current lives. Sometimes there are places that are in the past. There are grandparents' generation or a generation that has now been torn by war. And finally, not a surprise, since we're here at Collaborations for Cause, people give for causes. And I love this quote by one of the great documentary photographers who really has done more for causes than a lot of other people out there. And it's about making sure your images invoke that piece that not only just make people interested, it makes them want to give, makes them want to give of themselves, give money, give time, give expertise. I mean, this is where kind of the heart and soul of fundraising comes in, because when you're trying to connect with people, you want that sense that maybe just even one picture, maybe one single image, like this one about climate change, encapsulates all of the complex rhetoric that we see on the news, that we see in magazines or online, and tells that one quick visual story in our mind. Many of you probably have seen this, but I just want to show it just because it's such an amazing example of storytelling. And this was from the producers of a film called Racing Extinction. They projected images on the Empire State Building and several other buildings around the world. I've got a very quick video here. If I can get this to play. So I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the guy who probably shot a lot of this film right here. So thank you, Louis. I didn't know at the time I put this together, but I just wanted to point out that when you talk about collaborative efforts, this particular effort to get to this point involved 9 different individuals and entities out there, and I'm sure there were probably many more involved around. But this is a kind of effort that when you have a vision, when you reach out to other funders, you reach out to other partners, you can not only reach somebody on the web, you can reach them, I don't know how many this reached that night or in New York, probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions. More research. Why do people give? So if you look at causes, why do people give? Not a surprise. Religion is the biggest category people give to. Most people are very passionate about it, and depending on which church you go to, you may be asked to give every single week. So that's no surprise. Education is the second biggest category people give to. Most of this money goes to universities for things like buildings, scholarship funds, and endowed chairs. So there are some possibilities you may want to think about working in these areas, but mostly you're going to fund and you're going to take your work to one of these other categories. Third category is somewhat generic, but it's called human services. And this is an example, I think, of Dania Ferrato, who did this amazing story on domestic abuse. And there are other human service stories out there being told, like homeless veterans. These are upcoming photographs of people who have attempted suicide. This photographer took dozens of portraits of people who have attempted suicide and just showed them as individuals for who they are. And of course, the never-ending saga of poverty and what that means in our lives and how we can try to overcome it. Health is a big factor, no matter where you live and what kind of health issue you're looking at. Some parts of the world, certainly agricultural issues affect health. Certainly industrial issues affect health as well. And again, these stories, these individual images tell the story. They grab us so much with, why do I want to become involved? This is a quick little project here that involved actually people recovering from mental health to go out and take their own photographs. And this is a frightening image of female genital mutilation in Africa. Another story that, again, grabs you, but you want to learn more. The fifth category is called public benefit. And it's a somewhat broad category, but it's mostly about social issues. Things that we really want to engage in, want to know about, but it covers a rather broad spectrum. Because there's so many good stories out there, again, that your photography, your video work can tell if you reach out to the right funding sources. This next slide coming up here is about the First Nations in Canada, and a current campaign there. They're undergoing, at this very time, horrible suicide rate in First Nations in remote areas in Canada. Sometimes 24 people attempting suicide in 1 month in one tiny little village. Another category is arts and culture. It again can cover a lot of area out there, but there are stories to be told about both the vibrant art scenes in some areas, what culture means in both urban and rural areas, and especially what culture means as part of our past and our legacy. So I don't have to really go into much detail about this because of what it is, but I think that the next example also shows that funding is available not only just for telling your story, but how you tell your story. This was funding that was given to an interactive exhibition of photographs and objects that related to the photographs. And finally, the smallest category, I'm sorry to say, but one I know a lot about is environment. There are actually some smaller categories. There's some minor, like 1% categories. I didn't go into those. But environment, obviously, another really compelling issue. There are some horrible problems out there that need to be addressed. And again, compelling images that will tell those stories, hook people into wanting to learn more about those stories. There are, fortunately, some really nice places out there in the world, too, that it's important to know about. And part of what our foundation does is to help tell stories about protecting places that are still relatively untouched. So you might look at this and say, well, you know, I'm a photographer and, you know, I'm sort of more maybe fine artsy, you know, I do some documentary, but I bet my work just fits into this, you know, arts and culture category. It's a pretty small segment. But I'm going to say, no, your work actually fits into this larger category. You can find a place in there that at least 35% of all funding that's given out there probably fits in with something you're doing. So that's really important to keep in mind. So let me come back to this word, collaboration, why we're all here. And I think it's important to know right now in the funding world, in foundations, private donors, even corporations, collaboration is a hot word. There are two things right now that are really making a big difference out there. One is collaboration and one is storytelling. Every foundation person I talk to now wants to know, what's the story? How can we tell that story? And who's collaborating on this work? So it's a great time, actually, to be out trying to reach other funders and people who might want to support your work. So, I told you I'd come back to this guy. Remember, he got nearly equivalent of $10 million to do his project. But here's the thing. Curtis was this sort of ultimate perfectionist. He wanted control of every part of his project from beginning to end. And as the years passed by, people came to him from universities, other scientists, even a few other photographers, and said, hey, I'd be glad to help. This is a big project. And he said over and over again, nope, I got this. And meanwhile, the money started disappearing. He eventually devoted so much of his time to this project that he lost his photography business here. He went bankrupt. His wife divorced him. 10 years after he completed this project, he had to sell everything, all of the remaining glass plate negatives, all of the books for $1,000 just to pay off some bills. He wound up penniless and homeless and died destitute in the charity ward of a hospital. So I'm not saying if you don't collaborate, that this might happen to you, but I am saying that even $10 million sometimes won't get you to your goals if you don't find partners to work with. And speaking of collaboration, we've been talking a lot about it today. I don't know if we've ever actually said, well, what is collaboration? There are a number of different definitions out there. I happen to like this one the best, because I think it includes three very important elements: that you're planning and acting together, it's for a mutual benefit, and for a common purpose. And that's really important, because as you begin to look at how you plan and how you act together for a common purpose, I maintain that that starts with fundraising, that the very act of fundraising itself is when your collaboration begins. Don't think of going to a funder to fund my work for collaboration. Think of going to a funder as part of the collaboration. And that's, if you go with that frame of mind, with that thought, you're likely to have a better success story because you begin engaging the funder from the start as part of your work. So with that, I'll leave you with this thought. I'd ask all of you to get out there and be maladjusted.